She hit the floor before she even knew she was falling. The supply tray left her hands in what felt like slow motion: IV bags, wound dressings, 2 sealed syringes, and a full saline kit. And then it was all just noise and motion and the sick crack of plastic against polished linoleum. The lobby of Harcourt General Medical Center went quiet for exactly 1 second. Then the laughter started. Not from patients, not from visitors, from the staff. 24-year-old Mara Voss lay on her hands and knees in the middle of the main corridor, staring at the wreckage around her, and for a moment the only thing she could hear was her own pulse. Then the voice cut through everything else like a blade through paper. "Oh, for the love of... somebody get that cleaned up before a patient slips." Chief Administrator Douglas Pratt stood 20 feet away with a tablet under one arm and a coffee cup in the other, looking at Mara the way a man looks at a stain on his shoe. He didn't lower his voice. He didn't try to. 3 weeks on the floor, and she still can't carry a tray without turning it into a disaster. What exactly did they teach you in that program? Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. Mara pushed herself to her feet and started collecting supplies off the floor, her face down, her jaw tight. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to become invisible in a room full of people, this is your answer. It feels exactly like this. Stay with me through every part of this story. If you want to see how this ends, hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me what city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The morning had started badly and then kept getting worse, the way mornings at Harcourt General tended to for people at the bottom of the food chain. Mara had clocked in at 6:58, 2 minutes early, which meant nothing to anyone. She'd pulled her assignment from the board, a standard rotation across the third-floor medical unit, changed into scrubs in the locker room, and made it to her first station before 7:15. By 7:30, she'd already been corrected twice. Once by a charge nurse named Denise Farrow, who told her she was documenting vitals in the wrong column of the chart, and once by a physician named Dr. Raymond Yost, who told her, without looking up from his clipboard, that she was standing in the wrong part of the room. She hadn't been doing anything wrong either time. She'd checked afterward. Harcourt General was a 700-bed facility in the city of Caldwell, Montana, about 40 minutes northeast of the state capital and surrounded on 3 sides by federal land. It was the largest hospital in the county and the only Level 2 trauma center within a 100-mile radius, which meant it handled everything from routine surgeries to car accidents on the interstate. It also meant that the people who ran it had gotten comfortable with being the only option. That kind of comfort had a way of turning institutional. Mara had arrived from out of state 3 weeks earlier with a nursing degree, decent test scores, and no connections. She'd taken the Harcourt position because it was available, because the signing bonus helped with her moving costs, and because she'd thought that a hospital in a smaller market might be less cutthroat than the places she'd been warned about in the city. She'd been wrong about that. She was wrong about a lot of things at Harcourt. The locker room, for instance. She'd assumed it would feel neutral, a place to change, to decompress between shifts, to leave things and come back to them. Instead, it had become a place where she heard herself talked about in the third person while she was standing 6 feet away. The new one, Denise Farrow called her, when she was feeling generous. Others had other names. The rookie. The liability. One of the orderlies, a thick-necked man named Garrett, who'd been at Harcourt for 11 years and acted like he'd built the place, called her the Wobbler, which she'd eventually figured out was a reference to the way she'd stumbled on a wet floor her first week. She didn't say anything. She kept her head down. She documented carefully. She showed up on time. It didn't help. The supply run that morning had been a legitimate request. Denise had told her to bring a restocking cart up from Central Supply to the third-floor nurses' station and then bring excess materials back down to the main-floor storage room. It was the kind of task that didn't require skill, just hands and time, and that was exactly why it had been assigned to her. The cart had a stuck wheel that nobody had bothered to fix, and when Mara had tried to navigate it around the corner at the base of the elevator bank, the wheel had caught on a floor seam and the top tray had gone airborne. That was the sequence. Stuck wheel, floor seam, airborne tray. It was not incompetence. It was a broken cart that nobody had filed a maintenance request for because nobody who used it was important enough to bother. Douglas Pratt didn't ask what happened. He just stood there and made the comment about her nursing program, and then he turned to the woman standing beside him. Doctor. Alicia Strand, head of clinical operations and Pratt's primary ally on the administrative side, and said something that Mara couldn't hear but that made Strand's mouth tighten in what might have been amusement or might have been contempt. It was hard to tell the difference with Strand. Mara got the supplies back onto the tray. An orderly she didn't recognize helped her without being asked, which surprised her. He didn't say anything. He just gathered up the IV bags and stacked them and then moved on. And she was grateful for it in a way that felt disproportionate to the gesture, which told her something about how depleted she was already. She made it to the supply room. She came back up. She resumed her rotation. By 11 o'clock, the next thing had happened. A patient on the third floor, room 318, a 63-year-old man named Howard Finch, who'd been admitted 2 days earlier with a pulmonary embolism, had been flagged by the overnight chart review for a potential medication discrepancy. The concern was about anticoagulant dosing. His record showed one figure. The pharmacy log showed another. The numbers didn't match. This was a serious discrepancy. In a patient being treated for a blood clot, the margin for error on anticoagulant dosing was narrow. Too little, and you risked another clot. Too much, and you risked a bleed. The review had flagged it at 7 in the morning. By 11, when Dr. Yost finally looked at the chart in person, the question of who had logged which dosage had become urgent. Mara had documented Mr. Finch's medications during her rotation that morning. That was the connection. That was the only connection. She'd documented what she'd observed. The dosage as it had been drawn up and administered by the on-duty pharmacist, cross-referenced against the order in the system. What she had not done, what she had not been the one to do, was enter the original order. That had happened before her shift. The discrepancy had existed before she'd touched the chart. None of that mattered. By 11:15, she was standing in the hallway outside Pratt's office on the administrative level, and Pratt was standing inside it, looking at her through the glass like she was something he was about to return to a store. He opened the door. He didn't invite her in. He stayed in the doorway. "The Finch chart," he said. "I documented what I observed," Mara said. The discrepancy is in your documentation, because the order was entered incorrectly before my shift. I logged the actual administered dose, which is different from, that's not what the pharmacy log says. I know what the pharmacy log says. I'm telling you the log is wrong. The administered dose was, are you telling me the pharmacy made an error? It wasn't a question. It was a wall. Mara looked at him. She'd been awake since 5. She'd been on her feet since 7. She had a headache starting behind her left eye, and she hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 6:45. I'm telling you the numbers don't match because there are 2 separate records reflecting 2 separate events, she said. One is what was ordered. One is what was given. They should be reconciled. The patient is being handled, Pratt said. What I'm handling right now is the documentation error in your chart notes. It's not an error. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked past her at the administrative assistant at the desk across the hall, a woman named Bridget, who was watching without appearing to watch. "Miss Voss," Pratt said, "we're going to need you to clear your locker by end of shift." The words landed flat. Mara didn't move. "I'm sorry?" "You've been on staff for 3 weeks. In that time, we've had 3 incident reports connected to your rotations, a supply incident this morning that was witnessed by a dozen people, and now a medication documentation issue involving a high-risk patient." He said it in the tone of a man reciting something he'd rehearsed. "That's not a pattern we can sustain." 2 of those incident reports were about equipment failures, Mara said. The third one was, "End of shift," he said. "HR will have paperwork ready." He stepped back and closed the door. Mara stood in the hallway and stared at the glass for a moment. Then she turned around and walked to the elevator. Bridget, at the desk, looked down at her keyboard and didn't say a word. She spent 40 minutes trying to reach the nursing union rep, who didn't answer. She left a message. She tried the HR director, who told her there was a process and that the process had been followed and that she was welcome to submit a formal grievance within the allotted window. She spent 20 minutes at the nurses' station on 3 reviewing her own documentation, which she'd already reviewed 3 times in her head and which showed exactly what she remembered: the correct administered dose, logged correctly, with the timestamp in her credentials. The discrepancy wasn't hers. She knew whose it was. She'd figured that out around the second time she'd been pulled into the hallway that morning. The pharmacy order had been entered by a technician named Sheldon Brack, who'd been at Harcourt for 9 years and who had, Mara had noticed over 3 weeks, a habit of adjusting documentation retroactively when errors came to light. She'd noticed it because she'd been trained to notice things like that. She'd noticed other things too. Patient transfers that seemed irregular, inventory logs that didn't balance, supply orders that were larger than census numbers justified. She hadn't said anything about any of it. She was a 3-week-old nurse at a hospital where she didn't know the politics. She'd been watching, cataloging, waiting until she understood what she was looking at. Now she wouldn't get the chance. She cleaned out her locker. It took 11 minutes because she hadn't accumulated much. A few personal items, a stethoscope, 2 pens, a small notepad she kept in the front pocket of her scrub top. She packed everything into the tote bag she'd brought on her first day and zipped it up. Denise Farrow was in the locker room when she walked in. Farrow looked at the tote bag, then at Mara, and her expression didn't change. "Heard about the chart," she said. "Did you?" "Pratt's not known for second chances." Mara pulled on her jacket. She didn't answer. "Not trying to pile on," Farrow said. "Just saying, for what it's worth." She paused. "You're not the first person he's run out of here for asking the wrong questions." Mara stopped. She turned and looked at Farrow. The charge nurse was standing by the sink with her arms crossed, looking at the floor. She wasn't making eye contact. She looked like someone who'd just said something they hadn't planned to say. "What does that mean?" Mara asked. Farrow shook her head. "Doesn't matter now. Good luck." And she walked out. Mara stood alone in the locker room for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and went to the elevator. Security met her on the ground floor. Not the regular lobby security, so 2 of them, sent specifically, wearing Harcourt lanyards and expressions calibrated to look professional while communicating that they were there to make sure she left. One of them, a tall man named Pete, who'd always nodded at her when she passed the desk, didn't meet her eyes. The other one she didn't know. "We'll walk you out," the unknown one said. "I know where the door is," Mara said. "Policy," he said. She walked. They flanked her, just far enough apart to be ridiculous. The lobby was busy. Mid-morning, families coming in for visits, a cluster of people near the information desk, a few people in chairs along the wall. Several of them looked up. A few of the staff she recognized. People from her floor, from the ER rotation she'd done her first week, tracked her across the lobby with the careful non-expression of people who don't want to be associated with whatever is happening. She kept her head up. Her jaw was tight again. She concentrated on the doors. Then she was 20 feet from the exit, and one of the security guards said something into his radio, and through the wide lobby windows she saw it. Vehicles in the parking lot. Not the usual mix of civilian cars and hospital transport vans. Black vehicles. Large ones. Moving in a formation that civilian traffic didn't move in. Mara stopped. The guard to her left said, "Ma'am, we need to keep—" "Hold on," she said. She stood and watched through the glass as the vehicles pulled into the Harcourt General parking lot. There were more than she'd initially counted, at least a dozen, maybe more still coming around the corner from the access road. SUVs, trucks, one vehicle that was clearly a communications unit. They parked with the kind of deliberate spacing that wasn't an accident. Personnel were getting out. The lobby had gone quieter. Other people were noticing. A woman near the information desk had stopped mid-sentence and was staring. A nurse coming off an elevator looked through the window, paused, and looked again. Mara didn't move. She stood with her bag on her shoulder and her jacket half-zipped, and she watched the parking lot fill up, and for the first time since 7 in the morning, something in her chest that had been wound tight began to do the opposite. "Ma'am." The guard's voice had an edge in it now. She turned to look at him. "I know," she said quietly. She looked back at the windows. A man in uniform had stepped out of the lead vehicle. He stood for a moment with his back to the hospital, looking at his personnel, and then he turned. He was looking for something. Or someone. Mara shifted her weight slightly, the way she'd learned to do years ago when she needed to look smaller in a space, less obvious, less findable. Then the man in uniform began walking toward the hospital entrance. and the security guard's radio crackled with something urgent from the front desk. And behind Mara, deeper in the hospital, an alarm started going off. Not a routine alarm, not a code that meant paperwork, but the blunt, sustained tone that meant the emergency department had just activated mass casualty protocol. Everything happened at once. The alarm didn't stop. It cycled through its three-tone sequence: low, mid, high, and then repeated the way it was designed to, because the people who engineered mass casualty alerts understood that a sound you could tune out was a sound that got people killed. The lobby responded the way lobbies always respond to that sound: a half-second of collective freeze followed by controlled chaos. The woman near the information desk grabbed her phone. The family near the chairs stood up simultaneously. Two nurses who'd been crossing toward the elevators broke into a run without being told to. The security guard to Mara's left pressed his earpiece. His expression shifted. "We're going to need to," he started. "I heard the alarm," and Mara said. She was already moving, not toward the exit, back toward the interior of the hospital. "Ma'am, you're no longer authorized to..." She stopped and turned. "What's the protocol?" she asked. He blinked. "Mass casualty protocol. What's Harcourt's MCI response procedure for a lobby escort during a declared emergency? Do you still take me out, or do you return to your post?" He didn't answer immediately, which told her everything she needed to know about whether he'd actually read the policy manual. "Return to your post," she said. "That's the answer." She turned and walked toward the emergency department. Behind her, she heard him say something into his radio. She didn't stop to find out what. Her bag was still on her shoulder. She didn't put it down. She'd been in Harcourt's emergency department exactly once during her 3 weeks. A brief orientation tour on day 2, walking the layout with a group of new hires, none of whom were assigned there. She'd noted the layout the way she always noted layouts: exits, supply locations, the relationship between the trauma bays and the nurses' station, where the crash carts were, where the bottlenecks would form under pressure. She'd done this without thinking. It was the kind of thing that had become automatic years before she'd ever enrolled in nursing school. The ER was already in motion when she pushed through the double doors. The triage desk was overwhelmed, 2 nurses and a unit clerk trying to process incoming patients while the ambulance bay doors kept opening. She could smell it before she fully processed it: blood and road dust and the particular metallic odor of burns, which was different from other trauma smells in a way that was hard to describe, but impossible to confuse once you'd encountered it. She counted fast. 7 patients in visible distress in the waiting area alone, which meant the waiting area was functioning as overflow, which meant the trauma bays were already full or close to it. A man in a torn jacket was holding his arm against his chest in a way that suggested fracture. An older woman in the corner had a laceration across her forehead that needed pressure and wasn't getting it. A teenage boy sitting against the wall was too still and too pale. Mara dropped her bag behind the triage desk without asking. "What are we dealing with?" she asked the nearest nurse, a stocky woman in her 40s with short, gray-streaked hair, who was typing with one hand and holding a phone with the other. The woman looked up. "You're not ER. What are we dealing with?" A pause, then, "Tanker collision on Route 9 northbound about 6 miles out. Multiple vehicles. Fire and secondary explosions. EMS is still pulling people out." "How many incoming?" 40 plus confirmed, possibly more. We have capacity for 18 in the department." "Surgical?" 2 ORs prepping. 3rd is mid-procedure." "Pediatric?" The woman's jaw tightened. "Some." "Blood bank?" "Already called. Awaiting confirmation on supply." Mara was already moving toward the trauma bay. "Who's running triage?" "Dr. Okafor was. He's in Bay 2 with the chest." "Who's next in command?" "Theoretically Dr. Strand, but she's..." The woman stopped. "She's not here," Mara said. It wasn't a question. "She's been paged." Mara pushed through to the trauma corridor. The first thing she saw was a gurney parked sideways in the hallway because there was nowhere else to put it, and on it a man in his 50s with burns across his left arm and what looked like blast debris embedded in his shoulder. He was conscious and making noise, which was actually a good sign, though it didn't look like one. A young nurse, couldn't have been much older than Mara, hair pulled back, expression hovering somewhere between focused and panicked, was trying to establish an IV line while the gurney kept shifting. "Brace it against the wall," Mara said as she passed. The young nurse looked up. "Wheel lock's probably stuck. Push the left side against the wall and use it as your brace. Gives you a stable surface." Mara kept moving. "You're doing fine. Keep going." She made it to the first trauma bay. Inside, a woman in her 30s was on the table with a cervical collar half on and two residents arguing over her head about the CT sequence. The attending, a compact man named Dr. Okafor, whose reputation on the internal medicine floors was excellent and whose trauma experience Mara had no data on, was working the airway with focused intensity. He was good. The residents were slowing him down. "She needs the collar secured before imaging," Mara said from the doorway. One of the residents turned. "Who are you?" "The collar," Mara repeated. "If she moves during transport to CT and the collar's loose, you're creating the injury you're trying to image." Okafor glanced up. "She's right. Martinez, secure the collar. You prep for intubation. I want airway protected before she goes anywhere." The resident named Martinez started to say something, then didn't. Mara moved on. The next 40 minutes were not clean. They were not organized. They were not the kind of emergency response that got written up as a model in hospital journals. They were loud and imperfect and occasionally contradictory, and 3 times Mara had to repeat herself because the noise level in the corridor was high enough that normal speaking volume didn't carry. Once she gave an instruction that turned out to be based on incomplete information and had to revise it. Once she called for a medication and was told the supply room was temporarily inaccessible because a gurney had jammed the door, and she spent 45 seconds being furious about that before redirecting. But people were being stabilized. The teenage boy from the waiting area, the pale, too still one, had turned out to be a 15-year-old named Tyler, whose presenting symptoms had been read as shock, but who was actually hypoglycemic and had a partially occluded airway from inhaling smoke. He'd needed different interventions than the ones being prepped when Mara reached him. She'd caught it because she'd asked the right question before anyone started the IV push. Did he lose consciousness at the scene? Unknown, his mom said he was. Is she here? Where's the mother? Waiting area. Get her in here right now, not in 2 minutes. The mother, a woman named Sandra, who was herself bleeding from a cut on her chin and who had clearly been holding herself together through sheer willpower, had said, when asked directly, clearly with specific language, that Tyler had been complaining of feeling dizzy and weak since the night before, which was the piece of information that reframed everything. Tyler was transferred to a monitored bed and stabilized within 20 minutes of Mara reaching him. That was the shape of the next 40 minutes. Not heroic, not smooth. Messy decisions made fast with incomplete information, some of them right, some of them requiring correction, none of them made by someone who had the time to second-guess the previous one. Mara moved through it the way she moved through everything, with the specific, conserved energy of someone who had learned a long time ago that panic was a resource drain you couldn't afford. She didn't think about Pratt. She didn't think about the locker she'd emptied or the paperwork HR was waiting to give her or the security guards who'd been trying to walk her out. Those things existed in a different version of this day, and she'd deal with them when the current version ended. Right now, there were people who needed her to think clearly, so she thought clearly. It was around the 45-minute mark when Dr. Alicia Strand arrived. Mara knew she'd arrived before she saw her because the ambient noise in the corridor changed slightly. A particular kind of quiet that forms when someone with institutional authority enters a space and the people in that space aren't sure what's about to happen. Mara was at the nurse's station reviewing a chart when she felt it, and she looked up. Strand was in the corridor with 2 people behind her. She was in business clothes, not scrubs, which meant she'd come from somewhere outside the hospital rather than from her office. Her hair was slightly less composed than usual. She was scanning the department with the expression of someone assessing damage. Her eyes found Mara. The expression shifted, became something harder. She walked over. "What are you doing in here?" "Same thing everyone else is doing," Mara said. "You were escorted out. Mass casualty protocol supersedes administrative separation procedures. That's in the emergency operations plan." Mara looked at her steadily. I read the whole plan on week 1. Not everyone does. You are not authorized to be in this department. Dr. Okafor can speak to what I've been doing for the last 45 minutes. She nodded toward Bay 1. The teenager in Bay 4 is stable because someone asked his mother the right question before pushing fluids. The woman in Bay 2 has a secured airway because someone reminded your residents about collar protocol. The man in the corridor has a functional IV line because someone told your nurse to brace the gurney against the wall. She paused. I'm not looking for credit. I'm telling you what happened so you have accurate information. Strand stared at her for a long moment. You're not staff, she said finally. Not as of about 2 hours ago? No. Then you need to leave. We have personnel arriving. The situation is being managed. Her voice was flat and final. If you remain on premises without authorization, that's trespassing. I will have security remove you. Mara held her gaze for 3 seconds. Then she stepped back from the nurse's station and reached around the desk for her bag. She walked out of the ER. In the trauma corridor behind her, she heard Strand say something to one of the residents, too low to catch. The resident's response was equally quiet, but the tone of it wasn't agreement. The lobby was different than she'd left it. The cluster of families was still there, displaced and uncertain. The way civilians always looked when a building designed for one purpose was suddenly operating at a different gear. The information desk had 2 additional people behind it now, fielding calls. A television mounted near the waiting area chairs had been switched to a local news channel, and she could see footage from Route 9 without hearing it. Aerial shots of highway wreckage, emergency vehicles, what looked like a tanker truck on its side with the aftermath of fire still visible around it. She stopped and looked at the footage for a moment. The scale of it was larger than she'd estimated from inside the ER. That was 2 miles of interstate. That wasn't just a collision. That was a sustained catastrophic event, which meant the patient volume Harcourt had received so far was probably not the final count. She looked toward the main entrance. The military vehicles were still in the parking lot, more of them than she'd initially counted. She could see that now, from this angle. Personnel moving between vehicles with purpose, not urgency. Whatever they were doing out there, they weren't here for the accident. They'd arrived before the alarm. They'd been coming for a reason that had nothing to do with Route 9. She stood with her bag on her shoulder in the middle of the Harcourt General lobby, fired and trespassed, and holding a full picture of a situation that nobody in this building seemed to be seeing clearly, and she considered her options. She could leave. That was the cleanest option. Call the union rep again. Start the grievance process. Let whatever was happening outside happen without her involvement. She could stay in the lobby, not in the clinical areas. She'd respect that, barely for now, but present. Watching, available. The doors to the administrative wing opened. Douglas Pratt walked out with 2 members of his administrative team, heading toward the main entrance with the stride of someone who'd been notified of something significant and was managing his reaction to it in public. His jaw was set. His eyes went to the parking lot. He hadn't noticed Mara yet. She watched him take in the vehicles, watched his expression cycle through something she couldn't fully read, calculation, concern, a flash of something that might have been alarm, and then settle into the professionally neutral face he used for situations that required him to look unfazed. He pushed through the main doors. Mara followed at a distance. Outside, the temperature had dropped a few degrees since morning. The parking lot smelled like vehicle exhaust, and the faint chemical undertone that came off the mountains when the wind was moving from the northwest. The light was the flat white of a Montana November, the kind that made everything look like it was happening just slightly later in the day than it actually was. Pratt had stopped about 20 feet past the entrance. Standing in front of him was a man in a uniform that Mara recognized without having to think about it, the way you recognize certain things that your brain is indexed at a level below ordinary recall. Desert digital camouflage. Oak leaf clusters on the collar. The bearing of someone who'd spent enough years at altitude, emotional altitude, the altitude of command, that everything below it looked the same height. He was a lieutenant colonel. She put him at late 40s. He was speaking to Pratt with the calm, measured cadence of someone who was accustomed to being listened to and would wait indefinitely until he was. 2 aides flanked him at a slight distance. 4 additional personnel stood near the lead vehicle, watching the conversation without appearing to watch it. Pratt was nodding. He had his professional face on. He was performing competence. The lieutenant colonel said something, and Pratt's nodding slowed, said something else, and the nodding stopped. Mara was close enough now to hear fragments. The wind took some of it, but she caught pieces. Authorized access and coordination with the facility, and something about federal jurisdiction that made Pratt's left hand tighten around the tablet he was holding. She stayed back. She didn't want to be seen yet, but she was watching. The lieutenant colonel's name was on his chest. She was at the wrong angle for the first name, but the surname was visible. Harwick. He just handed Pratt something, a document of some kind, so folded papers, official looking. Pratt was reading it with the exaggerated care of someone who was trying to buy time. One of Harwick's aides caught Mara's position and looked at her directly, the way military personnel look at things they want to assess without appearing to. She held his gaze without moving. He looked away first. Harwick had not looked at her. He was still speaking to Pratt, but something in his posture, some infinitesimal adjustment of weight, a fractional turn of his head, suggested that he was aware of her presence. Pratt finished reading the document. He looked up. His expression was controlled in the way that expressions become controlled when the body is producing adrenaline and the brain is overriding it. "I'll need to consult with legal counsel before we can," he started. "Mr. Pratt," Harwick said, with a patience so complete it was almost its own form of pressure. "The document in your hand is a federal coordination order. It doesn't require your consent. It requires your cooperation. Those are different things." Pratt looked at the document again. "What exactly," he said carefully, "is the scope of—" "Broad," Harwick said. A long pause. "We'll need access to your administrative records," Harwick continued. "Billing, patient transfer logs, medication inventories, and your internal incident reports from the last 24 months. We'll need a secure room for a command briefing within the hour. And we'll need a list of personnel currently on premises who have administrative authority over those records." Pratt was very still. "That's a significant request," he said. "It is," Harwick agreed. "May I ask what this is in connection with?" Harwick looked at him for a moment. The look wasn't hostile. It was almost friendly, in the way that a firmly closed door can look friendly if the light is right. "We'll cover that in the briefing," he said. Behind Pratt, through the lobby windows, Mara could see more movement. The ER was still in crisis mode. The news ticker on the lobby TV was cycling through information about the Route 9 incident. People were moving through the building with the compressed energy of a place that had been pushed past its normal operating rhythm. And in the parking lot of Harcourt General Medical Center, a federal military coordination order was sitting in Douglas Pratt's hands, and the man who delivered it was standing with the specific patience of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing left to prove. Mara had spent years learning the difference between people who had institutional power and people who had actual authority. They weren't the same thing. They often wore similar clothes and used similar language, but under pressure they behaved completely differently. She was looking at actual authority right now. She was also, finally, starting to understand what she was actually looking at. The thought came to her not as a revelation, but as the slow, settling recognition of a pattern she'd been observing for 3 weeks without having the frame to put it in. The irregular transfers, the medication inventory discrepancies, the incident reports that disappeared, the patient records that didn't quite reconcile. The way Pratt had moved so quickly to terminate her, not because of the documentation error, that was the surface reason, the official reason, but because she'd been asking questions. Quietly, persistently, in the way of someone who was keeping track. Someone had noticed her noticing. The termination hadn't been about the cart or the chart. It had been about what she'd been paying attention to. She shifted her bag on her shoulder and looked at the vehicles again. 12, she counted now, possibly more around the far side. This wasn't a routine federal coordination visit. This wasn't liaison work around the Route 9 accident. They'd been in motion before the accident. They'd been coming here for something specific. She needed to think. She needed, if she was honest with herself, which she tried to be, to decide what her next move was. Because she had information. She had 3 weeks of carefully kept notes. She had dates and discrepancies and anomalies that she'd logged on her personal phone, because she hadn't known what else to do with them and hadn't wanted to put them anywhere the hospital could access. She had a record of everything she'd observed, and there was a federal military coordination team in the parking lot that was apparently investigating something inside this hospital. Harwick had turned slightly. He was speaking to one of his aides now, something low and quick. The aide nodded and moved toward the vehicles. Pratt was still holding the document. He'd stopped reading it. He was standing with it in his hands like it had weight he hadn't expected. Mara took a breath. She was 27 feet from a decision that would either be completely irrelevant or would change the next several years of her life. She was also standing in a parking lot with no active credentials and a tote bag containing a stethoscope and 2 pens. She took another breath, and then she walked toward Harwick. He saw her coming. She was certain of that, even though he didn't look at her directly until she was 10 feet away. Military peripheral vision was a real thing. You developed it because you needed it, and once you had it, you never really turned it off. She stopped at a distance that communicated respect, but not deference. She looked at him directly. "Lieutenant Colonel Harwick," she said. He looked at her. His expression gave nothing away, but his eyes moved across her in a single practiced assessment, her clothes, her bag, the way she was standing, the way she'd approached, and whatever he concluded from it, he kept to himself. "Ma'am," he said. It was a question disguised as a greeting. "My name is Mara Voss," she said. "I was a nurse at this facility until approximately 2 hours ago, when I was terminated." She didn't pause or modulate her tone. "I have documentation of medication inventory discrepancies, irregular patient transfer patterns, and internal incident reports that I believe were suppressed. I've been keeping records for the last 3 weeks." A beat. Harwick's expression hadn't changed, but something in the quality of his attention had shifted. It was subtle. She caught it anyway. 3 weeks, he said. "Since my first week. I didn't know what I was looking at initially. By week 2, I had a clearer picture." She held his gaze. "I was terminated this morning after flagging a medication documentation error. The error wasn't mine. The termination happened fast, faster than it should have for a routine performance issue, which suggested to me that someone had flagged me as a problem before the documentation issue gave them a reason to act." Pratt had turned. He was watching this conversation with an expression Mara didn't look at directly. Harwick was quiet for a moment. He looked at her in the way of someone who was running a parallel process. What she was saying against what he already knew, what fit and what didn't. "What kind of documentation?" he asked. "Written. Photographs of logs, time-stamped entries, nothing I accessed improperly. It's all from my direct patient care rotations." She shifted her bag slightly. "It's on my phone. I can show you right now, or I can send it to whatever secure channel you specify." Another pause. Longer this time. Harwick glanced at his aide, a brief, almost imperceptible exchange that communicated something Mara wasn't privy to. Then he looked back at her. "Miss Voss," he said, "I'm going to ask you to wait here for a few minutes." "Understood." He turned to one of his personnel and said something quietly. The man nodded and moved. Pratt took 2 steps forward. "Lieutenant Colonel, this woman has been separated from the facility. She's not authorized." "Mr. Pratt," Harwick said without turning. "I'll get back to you." Pratt stopped. Mara stood in the November cold with her bag on her shoulder and watched Harwick's aide move to the communications vehicle. She watched Pratt stand where he'd been told to stand. She watched the parking lot continue its organized, deliberate activity. She didn't know what the next 10 minutes would look like. She didn't know if the documentation she had would be useful or redundant or something they already had in a format better than hers. She didn't know what exactly was happening inside this hospital or how far up it went or who was in it. What she knew was that she'd spent 3 weeks watching something wrong happen in a place that was supposed to be about keeping people alive. She wasn't going to walk away from that. The aide emerged from the communications vehicle. He walked toward Harwick with purpose. Not a stroll, not a casual approach. The kind of walk that meant he had something to say, and what he had to say mattered. He reached Harwick and spoke in a voice too low for Mara to hear. Harwick's posture changed. Barely. A degree, maybe 2. But she caught it. He turned to look at her again. And this time his expression was different. Not warmer, exactly. but different in the specific way of someone who has just had a piece of information land that rearranges the picture they've been working with. He held her gaze. "Miss Voss," he said slowly, "how long did you say you'd been at this facility?" 3 weeks, she said. He nodded once, very slightly. And before that? The question sat in the cold air between them. Behind her, she heard the ER ambulance bay doors open again. Another incoming unit, another round of it, the accident still sending its consequences down the road toward them in waves. In front of her, Harwick was waiting. She looked at him for a moment, and then she told him. His expression didn't change exactly, but his stillness did. There's a particular quality of attention that certain people develop. People who have spent time in environments where reading another person quickly and correctly was the difference between a good outcome and a catastrophic one. It isn't intensity. It isn't scrutiny. It's closer to the opposite of those things, a kind of deliberate settling, like a lens finding its focal point. Harwick had it. Mara recognized it because she had it too, or something like it, though she'd never thought of it in those terms until she was standing across from someone else who carried the same quality and felt the recognition move through her like a frequency. She told him her background in the same flat, factual tone she used for everything. Concise. No editorializing. She'd served as a combat medic attached to Marine infantry units for 4 years following enlistment at 18, 2 deployments overseas, one theater where the tempo of contact was high enough that her unit had operated almost entirely without reliable medical evacuation for a stretch of 11 weeks, which had required her to manage injuries that were outside the scope of what a field medic was supposed to handle alone. She'd done it anyway because the alternative was watching people die at closer range than she could accept. She'd separated honorably, returned stateside, completed her nursing degree in 3 years, taken the Harcourt position. That was it. That was the whole of it. Harwick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment in the way of someone organizing rather than processing. He'd taken it in cleanly the first time, she could tell, and now he was fitting it into a structure he already had. "Which unit?" he said. She told him. Something moved across his face. Brief, controlled. But there. He looked at his aide again. The aide had his phone out and was moving away, making a call with the focused body language of someone who had been given a specific task and was executing it. "Miss Voss," Harwick said, "the documentation you mentioned, is it on your phone right now?" "Yes." "I'm going to ask you to hold on that for approximately 15 minutes. Don't send it to anyone. Don't delete anything. Can you do that?" "Yes." "And I need you to stay visible. Don't go back inside the building." She looked at him steadily. "You already know something about this hospital." It wasn't a question. 15 minutes, he said. He turned and walked toward the communications vehicle, and the 2 aides fell in behind him, and Mara was left standing in the parking lot with the wind coming off the mountains and the ambulance bay behind her cycling through another incoming unit, and Douglas Pratt, 12 feet to her left, trying very hard to look like he wasn't watching every second of what had just happened. She didn't look at Pratt. She looked at the communications vehicle and waited. Chunk. The 15 minutes were actually 22, which she knew because she checked her watch twice and spent the interval doing what she'd trained herself to do in any situation that required waiting under pressure. She cataloged what she could observe. The personnel in the parking lot numbered 31 at her current count, across a range of roles she could partially identify by bearing and equipment. The communications vehicle had a satellite uplink that had been active since the convoy arrived. She could see the dish orientation. 2 of the SUVs had government plates that weren't standard DoD, which suggested interagency involvement. Whatever Harwick was coordinating, it wasn't purely military. Pratt had gone back inside, which told her something. A man who felt he had leverage would have stayed outside. A man who needed to make phone calls went inside. At the 22-minute mark, Harwick came back. He had a woman with him now. Someone Mara hadn't seen exit any of the vehicles, which meant she'd been inside already, possibly in an advance team that had entered before Mara had come back outside. She was in civilian clothes, dark slacks, a gray jacket, hair pulled back. Federal ID on a lanyard that she'd tucked inside her jacket, but the shape of it was visible. Late 30s. The kind of face that had learned to give away exactly as much as it needed to, and not a degree more. "This is Special Agent Torrance," Harwick said. "She's been coordinating an investigation that intersects with your situation in ways we need to discuss." Torrance looked at Mara with the same calibrated assessment Harwick had used. "You were on the third floor medical unit, primarily?" "Third floor and some ER coverage during my first week orientation," Mara said. "Did your rotations ever include pharmacy or billing access?" "No direct access, but I was in the medication room on 3 multiple times during my shift." "And the discrepancies you documented, did you note specific dates and times, or just the nature of the discrepancy?" "Specific dates and times. Some of them have the chart reference numbers as well, from what I could see on the screen. I wasn't taking photographs of patient data. I was noting the administrative anomalies in the inventory and transfer logs that were visible from the nurse's station." Torrance glanced at Harwick. Not long, a half-second at most, but it had content. "Can you show me your phone?" she said. Mara took it out and opened her notes. Torrance looked at the screen without taking the phone. She scrolled slowly, reading. Mara watched her read and didn't say anything. After about 90 seconds, Torrance handed the phone back. "We're going to need a formal statement from you. That's going to take time. We don't have this minute." She looked at Harwick. "She goes in with us." Harwick nodded once. Torrance looked at Mara. "Whatever Pratt's people told you about your employment status, set it aside for right now. You're coming in as a cooperating witness, not as a member of staff. Different category. Understood?" "Understood," Mara said. "And whatever you see and hear in the next hour doesn't leave the building in any form until I tell you it can." "Yes." Torrance turned and walked toward the entrance. Harwick fell into step beside Mara. "Your unit," he said quietly. "I served with someone who worked with that unit in the second deployment. Different battalion, overlapping timeline." She looked at him. "Small world," he said. "It always is," she said. They went inside. What happened in the next 40 minutes would have looked, to anyone watching from the outside, like bureaucratic movement. People going in and out of rooms, documents being handled, low-voiced conversations in corridors. It didn't look like the thing it was, which was the careful, methodical exposure of a system that had been running quietly and profitably and at significant cost to the people it was supposed to serve. Torrance commandeered a conference room on the administrative level. Not asked for it, commandeered it, in the specific sense that she produced documentation that made the request non-negotiable and then moved in before anyone could formulate an objection. 4 members of her team followed with equipment, 2 laptops, a portable scanner, and a case that contained materials Mara didn't have full visibility into. Harwick's personnel took positions at the stairwells and the main administrative corridor, with the relaxed attentiveness of people who were doing something they'd done many times and didn't need to perform urgency about. Pratt appeared at the conference room door approximately 8 minutes after they entered. He had a man with him whom Mara didn't recognize. Expensive suit, the particular tension of someone who billed by the hour and had been called faster than normal. Torrance let Pratt's attorney speak for 45 seconds. Then she laid a document on the table. "Federal warrant," she said, "signed this morning, before your client arrived at work today." She looked at the attorney, not Pratt. "The warrant covers all records, physical and electronic, related to patient billing, medication procurement and dispensing, transfer authorizations, and internal compliance documentation for the period starting 31 months ago." She paused. "Your client is welcome to remain present during the initial records review. He is not authorized to access, alter, or remove any document covered by the warrant. If he attempts to do so, that's obstruction, and we will act accordingly." The attorney leaned close to Pratt and said something in his ear. Pratt's face had gone through several stages in the last 30 seconds. The current one was the particular gray-white of someone whose body had arrived at a conclusion before their brain was ready to acknowledge it. "You'll want to sit down, Mr. Pratt," Torrance said. It wasn't unkind. It was just the truth. He sat. Mara stood against the wall of the conference room and watched this and felt something that wasn't satisfaction exactly. Satisfaction implied a clean, simple pleasure, but was closer to the sensation of a weight she hadn't fully registered until it started to lift. She'd been carrying the knowledge of what she'd been watching for 3 weeks. Carrying it alone, without context, without certainty about what it meant, or whether anyone else would see what she was seeing, or whether she was wrong about all of it. She wasn't wrong. That was the thing landing in her chest right now, not triumph. Just the strange, slightly vertiginous feeling of being right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. Torrance's team worked fast and methodically, and Mara stayed where she was and observed. And at one point, Torrance came and stood next to her and looked at the same wall of documentation her team was photographing and said quietly, "The medication inventory you flagged, that's part of a diversion scheme. Controlled substances. They were purchasing and billing at full capacity and redirecting a portion of the inventory before it ever hit the floor." Mara absorbed this. "How long?" "Best current estimate, 14 months. Possibly longer, but the paper trail gets murkier before that." She paused. "The transfers you noted, high acuity patients being moved to affiliated facilities, some of those patients weren't stable enough to be transferred. They were moved anyway. For billing purposes. Different facilities, different billing structures, different insurance thresholds." Torrance's voice was flat and factual, the way voices got when they were delivering information that, if you let yourself feel it fully, would make it very difficult to keep functioning. 3 of those patients had adverse outcomes post-transfer. Mara was quiet for a moment. 3, she said, "that we've confirmed. The investigation is ongoing." Mara looked at the documents on the table. She thought about Howard Finch in room 318 with his mismatched dosing records. She thought about what would have happened to him eventually in a system that moved inconvenient patients to other facilities and adjusted records after the fact. "Who else in the administration?" she said. "Still developing. Pratt is the center of it, but he didn't run it alone. Dr. Strand is a person of interest. The pharmacy director, man named Kellerman, we've been looking at for 8 months." Sheldon Brock, Mara thought. The technician who adjusted documentation retroactively. Below Kellerman, following his lead or following orders. "There's a pharmacy tech," she said. "Brack. He was the one who altered the dosing record that was used as the pretext for my termination." Torrance nodded. She was already writing something. "We'll pull his records." Otat. By the time Mara walked out of the conference room, the afternoon light through the administrative wing windows had gone the color of old brass, which meant it was past 3. She hadn't eaten. Her feet hurt. She was tired in the specific bone-level way of someone who had been operating on adrenaline since before 7 in the morning and was starting to feel the edge of it wearing off. She took the stairs down instead of the elevator, not for any particular reason, just because she needed to move in a straight line for a moment, needed the simple physical logic of descent. At the second-floor landing, she stopped and leaned against the wall and breathed. The stairwell was quiet. Institutional acoustics, the faint hum of ventilation, the distant murmur of the hospital operating on its normal frequencies beneath the disruption of the day. She was thinking about Denise Farrow. You're not the first person he's run out of here for asking the wrong questions. Farrow had known something, or suspected something. She'd said it without saying it, in the way of someone who'd decided the risk of saying it directly was more than they were willing to take. How many people in this building had known something? How many had looked at the discrepancies and decided, not without reason, not stupidly, that the cost of acting on what they saw was too high? She wasn't angrier about that than she thought she should be. She understood it. She'd spent 4 years in environments where the cost of speaking up was concrete and immediate, and she'd watched people make calculations under that kind of pressure that they'd never make in a different context. She didn't have contempt for it. She just couldn't do it herself. Had never been able to. It was possibly a character flaw. She pushed off the wall and went down the last flight. The ER was still running at elevated capacity, but the chaos of the morning had compressed into something more organized. The triage backlog had cleared, the trauma bays had cycled through their highest acuity cases, and what remained was the dense, exhausting middlework of a department that had absorbed a mass casualty event and was now processing the aftershock. Nurses moving with the ground-down efficiency of people 4 hours past their surge peak. Residents who'd been thrown into situations beyond their training and had managed and were now feeling the full weight of having managed. Mara pushed through the doors. The stocky nurse with gray-streaked hair, the one who'd been at the triage desk when Mara had first come in, was at the central station, reviewing a chart. She looked up when the doors opened. Her name badge said Plunkett, K. "You're back," she said. "In a different capacity," Mara said. Plunkett looked at her for a moment. Then she looked at the doors to the administrative wing, where she could presumably see, or sense, the change in the building's atmosphere, the way a hospital knows when something is happening in its walls. "The feds," Plunkett said. Not a question. "Yes." Plunkett set the chart down. She picked it up. She set it down again. "The boy, Tyler. He's stable." "Good. What you did with the mother, asking her directly the way you did, that was right." Mara nodded. "You've done this before," Plunkett said. "Not nursing." Mara looked at her. "Long time ago." Plunkett seemed to accept this without needing the details. She had the quality of someone who'd worked enough shifts to understand that people arrived at nursing from a variety of directions, and that the direction mattered less than what they did when they got there. "Strand went upstairs 20 minutes ago," she said. "Haven't seen her come back down." "She won't be running this department much longer," Mara said. Plunkett absorbed this. Her expression didn't change in any dramatic way, but something in her shoulders released, almost imperceptibly, the kind of physical response to relief that happens below the level of performance. "There's a patient," she said. "Bay 7. Military ID on intake. He came in with the Route 9 casualties, but his injuries they're not consistent with the accident." Mara stilled. "What do you mean not consistent?" "He's got older wounds, healed poorly, signs of previous surgeries that weren't done here." Plunkett's voice stayed neutral, but her eyes weren't. "He was agitated on intake, kept asking for specific people. He mentioned a name. I wrote it down because he said it 3 times. She slid a piece of paper across the station counter. Mara looked at the name on the paper. She didn't know the man in Bay 7. She'd never met him. But she knew the name he'd been asking for because it was written in a report she'd filed 4 years ago that she'd assumed nobody outside a very specific chain of command had ever read. Her own name. In a context she hadn't thought about in 3 years. "Bring me his chart," she said. "What?" His name was Darnell Pugh. He was 38, African-American, 6'1", and significantly underweight for his frame in the way of someone who'd had a period of severe physical stress in the not-distant past. His military ID was current. His intake chart showed blunt force trauma to the left shoulder and a laceration along the right forearm from the Route 9 accident, both moderate severity, neither life-threatening. What wasn't on the intake chart was visible when she pulled back the gown, a surgical scar below his left rib cage that was 6 months old at most, done under conditions that were not a civilian hospital. She could tell by the closure technique, which was functional and competent, but not the kind of fine work that happened in a controlled OR with adequate lighting and time, and 3 older scars on his back that she recognized because she'd seen similar patterns before, in a context that was not medical. He was awake when she came in. His eyes went to her face and stayed there. "You're Voss," he said. His voice was rough. He'd been breathing smoke. His airways had the slightly raw quality of someone who'd been at the accident scene before being transported. "I am," she said. "They said you were here. The guys outside. They said you were the nurse." "I'm a nurse, yes." She set his chart on the bedside table and looked at him directly. "How do you know my name?" He looked at the door. It was closed. "Is this room being monitored?" "Probably not. The hospital's having a complicated afternoon." She kept her voice even. "Mr. Pugh, I need to assess your injuries. The ones on your intake chart and the ones not on it. Can we do that first and then talk?" He held her gaze for a moment, then he nodded. She worked efficiently. The shoulder was a grade 2 AC separation, painful, not dangerous. The forearm laceration needed cleaning and closure, which she did with the materials on the room's tray cart while he sat still and breathed carefully. The surgical scar below his ribs she assessed by touch and observation without pressing, because it was still in the healing phase and the accident had likely stressed it. "Someone opened you up in a hurry," she said. "About 7 months ago." "Where?" He named a place that was not on any commercial map. She absorbed this without reacting. They do good work under the circumstances. Circumstances were bad. They usually are. She tied off the closure on his forearm. You weren't in that tanker accident by chance. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. No. You were coming here. A pause. To the general area. The accident complicated things. Who sent you? He reached into the back of his gown, a gesture she tracked without moving because old instincts were old instincts, and produced a folded card, not a business card. A smaller, heavier stock, the kind that didn't go through commercial printers. She took it. There was a name on it, a rank, and below that, a unit designation that she hadn't seen written down since the day she'd separated from service, because it was the kind of designation that didn't get written down. Her hand was steady. She was proud of that, in a distant, detached way. He's here, she said. He was supposed to be, Pugh said, before the accident rerouted everything. He paused. He's been looking for you for about 2 months. Didn't want to disrupt your civilian life if you'd moved on from all of it. But the situation changed. What situation? He looked at the door again. The investigation you stumbled into at this hospital. You think that started with you flagging inventory discrepancies? She looked at him. The people running this billing scheme, he said, they're connected to a procurement network that goes up higher than a hospital administrator in Caldwell, Montana. Significantly higher. He held her gaze. The federal team outside, they know some of it. They don't know all of it. There are people who've been building the full picture for the better part of a year. People who need a specific type of witness. Someone who can speak to both the clinical irregularities and certain related activities that the hospital investigation is going to brush up against. She was very still. Someone like you, he said. I've been here 3 weeks, she said. I'm a first-year nurse who got fired this morning. You're also the only person who worked both sides of this and came out with documentation and your credibility intact. He paused. And you're the only one in this building that Harwick's people can fully trust because of who you are and where you've been. She set the card down on the bedside table. Outside the room, she could hear the ER running, monitors, voices, the controlled noise of a department that had taken a heavy hit and was still moving. In the administrative wing above her, Torrance's team was pulling records. In the parking lot, Harwick's personnel were still in position. And somewhere in this tangled, overloaded afternoon, a thread she'd thought she'd left behind 4 years ago had just pulled taut. You need to tell Harwick about this, she said. Already has been told, Pugh said. The question is whether you're willing to make a statement that goes beyond the hospital investigation. She looked at the card on the table. She looked at Pugh. She looked at the closed door of Bay 7. Then the door opened. Harwick stood in the frame. He wasn't looking at Pugh. He was looking at Mara, and his expression had the quality of a man who was about to say something that he'd thought carefully about before saying it. Miss Voss, he said, we need you in the conference room, right now. Why? She said. Because Pratt's attorney just tried to file an emergency injunction to halt the records review, he said. And because 30 minutes ago, somebody accessed the hospital's internal server from an off-site location and started running a deletion protocol on the medication procurement files. His jaw was tight. And because the person we think initiated that deletion, based on the access credentials used, is someone whose name I believe you're going to recognize. He said the name. Mara recognized it. Her mouth went dry. That's not possible, she said. That person left the hospital 6 months ago. They were transferred, Harwick said, to an affiliated facility, which is currently under separate federal investigation. He held the door. I need you in that room, Miss Voss, because you may be the only person in this building who understands what you're looking at when you see the full records. She stood up. She picked up her bag. Pugh's hand caught her wrist. Not hard, just contact. She looked down at him. Whatever you saw in those 3 weeks, he said quietly. It matters. All of it. She looked at him for a second. Then she walked out of Bay 7 and followed Harwick down the corridor, and the door swung shut behind them, and somewhere above them the deletion protocol was running against a clock that nobody had told her how much time was left on. The stairs were faster than the elevator. Harwick took them 2 at a time, and Mara kept pace without being asked, and they were on the administrative level in under a minute, and the conference room was louder than she'd left it. 2 of Torrance's people at laptops with the particular fast quiet of professionals in a race against something, a third on a phone call that she'd stepped to the corner to take, her voice too low to catch but her posture communicating urgency without hysteria. Torrance herself was at the head of the table with a split screen open on a tablet, one side showing what looked like a server activity log, the other showing a file directory tree with a column of red timestamps cascading down it. "How much has been deleted?" Harwick said. "We're still quantifying," Torrance said without looking up. The protocol hit the procurement files first: medication purchase orders, vendor invoices, the authorization chain for controlled substance acquisition. It's targeted. Whoever wrote it knew exactly what they were going for. Can you recover it? Some of it. The server logs the deletion events even when it can't log the content, and we got a partial mirror from an automated backup that ran at 11 this morning. So anything added or modified after 11 is gone, but we have a snapshot up to that point. She looked up. The problem is the authorization chain. The backup has the procurement numbers but not the sign-off trail. Without the sign-offs, we can prove supplies were purchased. We can't prove who approved them. Mara had moved to stand beside the table where she could see the screen. The file directory on the right side showed a folder structure she recognized, not because she'd accessed it, but because she'd seen the naming convention in the corner of a screen at the nurse's station, twice, when the pharmacy director's assistant had been logged in and hadn't thought to angle her monitor. "The authorization chain," she said. Torrance looked at her. "It's not just in the procurement files," Mara said. "When I was on the third floor, I saw a separate log. The pharmacy assistant had it open, a spreadsheet. It looked like an internal approval matrix, different from the standard medication administration records. It had initials and a numbering system that didn't match the patient chart format." Torrance's expression sharpened. "You saw this on whose workstation?" "The assistant to the pharmacy director. Her name is Flores. She sits outside Kellerman's office. I walked past that station probably 6 or 7 times. She had it open at least twice that I saw." Mara paused, pulling the memory into focus. It was a shared drive file. I could see the path at the top of the screen. It wasn't in the pharmacy system directory. It was in a general administrative shared drive. Torrance was already turning to one of her team members. "Rivera, general administrative shared drive. Anything that isn't in the standard department folders." "On it," the man said, hands moving. "The deletion protocol," Mara said. "Would it have covered the administrative shared drive?" "Depends on how it was written," Torrance said. "If whoever initiated it was targeting specific directories, they might have missed anything outside those directories." She looked at Rivera. "How fast?" 2 minutes, he said. The room compressed into the specific silence of people waiting for something that mattered. Harwick stood with his arms crossed and his weight balanced in the way of someone who'd spent a long time in rooms where waiting was a tactical condition. The agent on the phone finished her call and came back to the table and said something to Torrance in a murmur. Torrance's jaw tightened. "Pratt's attorney filed the injunction," she said to Harwick. "Judge Reeves. They're saying the warrant is overbroad." "Reeves?" Harwick said. "I know. We're contesting. But if they get a temporary stay, how long would that give them?" "Realistically, 4 to 6 hours, possibly through the end of business." Harwick looked at the deletion log on the tablet screen. "They don't need 4 hours. They've been running that protocol for 30 minutes, and the critical files are already gone." "Which is why I need that administrative drive," Torrance said, and looked at Rivera. "Got it," Rivera said. "Shared drive, administrative, general folder. I've got... Okay, there's a subfolder here that isn't labeled by department. It's labeled by date range." He turned the laptop so the table could see it. 28 months of files." Torrance moved to his side of the table. Mara moved with her. The subfolder contained what she'd suspected, a parallel record system. Not sophisticated, it was a spreadsheet, the same one she'd glimpsed on Flores's screen, but thorough. Each row was a transaction, columns for purchase quantity, billed quantity, the difference between the two, and a column of alphanumeric codes that Mara looked at for 3 seconds before she understood what they were. "Those are patient billing IDs," she said. "The last column." Torrance looked at her. "I processed billing reference codes in my documentation. That format, 5 digits, letter, 3 digits. That's Harcourt's patient billing format. She looked at the spreadsheet. They billed the diverted medication to patient accounts. The room was very quiet. They charged patients, Harwick said, for medication those patients never received. And collected from insurance? Torrance said, almost to herself. Then louder. Rivera, I need a cross-reference. Pull 3 patient accounts from that list, random selection, and match them against the actual administration records. 3 minutes. That was how long it took. The first patient account showed a charge for a controlled substance on a date when the patient had been discharged 12 hours earlier. The second showed a charge for a dosage 3 times higher than anything in the administration record. The third showed a charge for a medication that was not in the patient's treatment plan at any point during their admission. Torrance stood up straight. She looked at Harwick. Her voice was flat and precise. We have enough to hold everyone named in the warrant, right now, regardless of the injunction. Harwick nodded once. He took out his phone. Bapchat. What happened in the next 20 minutes was not dramatic in the visual sense. There were no shouted commands, no running in corridors, no scenes that would read as cinematic from the outside. It was the quiet, deliberate work of people who'd prepared for this and were now executing it, which had its own particular quality. The difference between a fire and a controlled burn. Harwick's personnel moved to positions inside the building. 2 federal agents went to the pharmacy director's office. Kellerman was at his desk. He looked up when they entered and then looked at the document they placed in front of him and then looked at the door as though he was calculating something, and then he stopped looking at the door. Sheldon Brack was located in the break room on the 2nd floor eating a sandwich. He was asked to come with them. He asked why. They told him. He put the sandwich down and didn't finish it. Doctor. Alicia Strand was in her office with her phone to her ear when the agents arrived. She ended the call when she saw them. She stood up and said, in the voice of someone who'd spent 15 years being the most powerful person in most rooms, "You're making a mistake." The senior agent said, "Please come with us, Dr. Strand." She came with them, but her jaw was set in a way that said this wasn't over for her yet, that she was already planning the next move, and that whatever move she was planning was going to require a very good attorney and a very long time. Pratt was still in the conference room with his attorney when 2 agents entered, and the attorney stood up immediately and began saying things in a rapid, layered way that communicated that he'd been expecting this and had prepared for it and that his client had nothing to say. Pratt let his attorney talk. He sat in his chair with his hands flat on the table and the document he'd been holding since the parking lot still in front of him, slightly wrinkled now from where he'd been gripping it, and he looked at the tabletop for a long moment before he stood. He didn't look in Mara's direction. She was standing in the corridor outside the conference room when they brought him out, and she stepped back to let them pass. And he walked with the contained, diminished posture of a man who'd built an identity around institutional authority and was now moving through the institution he'd run without any of it. She didn't feel the need to say anything. She didn't feel the need to do anything at all. She just watched him go. The afternoon had gone dark by the time the immediate operational phase was done. The November light in Caldwell dying early, the way it did at this latitude, the windows of the administrative wing going from brass to gray to black while the work continued. Mara had given her formal statement to a federal recorder in a side office. 45 minutes of precise, chronological account with her phone documentation cross-referenced and time-stamped and logged into evidence. The agent who took the statement was thorough and professional and asked her to clarify 4 points, all of which she could clarify because she'd kept accurate records. When it was done, she sat in the chair for a moment and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Then she went to find something to eat. The hospital cafeteria was in a weird in-between state, past the dinner rush, but the staff was still there, running on the compressed energy of a building that had absorbed a mass casualty event and a federal investigation in the same 12-hour period and hadn't fully metabolized either. She got a coffee and a sandwich she didn't taste and sat at a table in the corner and ate with the methodical purpose of someone who understood that their body had run a deficit today and needed to be maintained. Plunkett appeared at the table 15 minutes later with a tray of her own. "You mind?" she said. "Sit down," Mara said. Plunkett sat. She looked older in the cafeteria light, the kind of tired that came from years of it, not just one day. She drank her coffee and looked at the middle distance. "Kellerman," she said finally. "How long?" At least 14 months on the diversion, probably longer. Plunkett wrapped both hands around her cup. I worked under him for 6 years. I know. I didn't. She stopped, started again. There were things that didn't add up in the inventory. I told myself I was wrong, that I didn't understand the purchasing system well enough, that there was a reason. She paused. I think I just didn't want to be right. Mara looked at her. Choosing not to see something that scares you isn't the same as being complicit in it. Isn't it? Not legally, not morally, if you didn't have enough to act on. She paused. You told me what Pharaoh said to me. You didn't have to do that. Plunkett shook her head slightly. That was just, I wanted you to know you weren't alone in noticing. That was enough, Mara said. Sometimes that's all someone needs. They sat in silence for a while. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd been through a long day and didn't need to fill it. Pharaoh's going to want to talk to the investigators, Plunkett said eventually. She knows more than she let on to you. I figured. She's scared. She should cooperate anyway, Mara said. The investigators will be better positioned to protect her than staying quiet will. Plunkett looked at her. You going to tell her that? If she wants to hear it, Zeb. Harwick found her at the table 20 minutes later. He came alone without aides or documentation, which told her this wasn't official, or not primarily official. He got a coffee from the line and came and sat down, and Plunkett read the room accurately and excused herself, and it was just the two of them. He looked tired. She hadn't expected that, not because she thought he was impervious to exhaustion, but because he'd projected such consistent steadiness all day that seeing the weight of it on him now felt like a shift in the room's pressure. The injunction was denied, he said. Good. Reeves took about 4 minutes to read the briefing and dismiss it. He drank his coffee. Pratt's attorney is good, but he was working with what he had, which at that point wasn't much. What happens to them now? Federal holding tonight, arraignment tomorrow most likely. The DA's office is involved now. There are state charges layered under the federal ones, specifically related to the patient billing fraud. He set his cup down. It's going to be a long process. A year, maybe more, before it resolves. She nodded. She'd understood that. These things didn't resolve in a day. The patient records, she said, the 3 who had adverse outcomes after the irregular transfers. Being reviewed. If the transfers directly contributed to those outcomes, and the initial read suggests at least 2 of the 3, that's additional charges. Different category. He paused. That part will probably take the longest. She looked at her coffee. Pew, she said. He's being discharged tonight. His injuries are stable. Harwick paused. He wasn't supposed to be on Route 9. He was en route to a different access point when the accident cut off his primary route, and he got pulled into the response as a bystander. A slight pause. Unlucky timing. Or lucky, she said. He ended up in this building. Harwick's mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but the shape of one. The statement you gave, the part that goes beyond the hospital investigation, that's going to be followed up by a different team than Torrance's. You should be prepared for that to happen within the next week. Prepared how? They'll contact you through formal channels. It'll look official because it is official. Just be ready for it to be more involved than today. She looked at him. You knew about me before today? A pause. The name came up in connection with the unit, he said. 7, 8 months ago, when the broader investigation was starting to map the network. There was a reference, a field report from 4 years back, that intersected with one edge of what we've been looking at. He held her gaze. We didn't know you were at Harcourt. That was genuinely coincidental. There's a version of this where I just walked out the door this morning, she said. Yes, he said. There is. They were both quiet for a moment. Pugh said there's someone looking for me, she said. Harwick was quiet for a beat longer than the question required. Colonel Devereaux, he said. She hadn't heard that name spoken out loud in 3 years. She'd thought about it, maybe 4 or 5 times. Well, the way you think about the people who shaped a significant period of your life in flashes without dwelling. She hadn't expected to hear it in a hospital cafeteria in Caldwell, Montana on a Tuesday in November. He's well, Harwick said. Good, she said, which was inadequate, but it was what she had. He'll reach out when the timing is right. A pause. He wanted you to know that the commendation that was submitted for your unit's action in the 11th week, it was approved about 2 years ago. It just... He stopped. The notification process failed. An administrative error on the separating end. She looked at him. You should have received a formal notification, he said. You didn't. That's being corrected. She sat with that for a moment. She didn't know what she felt about it. Something complicated and quiet that she'd probably need more than this specific moment to sort through. That's not why you're telling me this tonight, she said. No, he agreed. But it needed to be said. He stood up. Get some rest, Miss Voss. Tomorrow is going to be its own version of complicated. She watched him go. She finished her coffee. Outside the cafeteria windows, the parking lot was still partially lit by the portable floodlights Harwick's team had set up during the operation, and she could see a few of his personnel still moving between vehicles, the quiet wind-down of a deployment that had accomplished what it came to accomplish. The vehicles would probably be gone by morning. The federal agents would stay longer, days, possibly weeks, working through the records. The hospital would still be here, still running. Understaffed now, with 3 senior administrative figures and the pharmacy director gone, which was going to create immediate operational problems that had nothing to do with justice and everything to do with the simple logistics of keeping a 700-bed facility functioning. That was tomorrow's problem. She stood up and threw away her cup and walked back toward the main corridor. She found Denise Farrow in the stairwell on the 2nd floor, which she suspected was not a coincidence. Farrow was sitting on the landing with her back against the wall and her arms wrapped around her knees like someone who'd retreated to the only quiet place they could find. And she looked up when Mara came through the door, and her face went through several things quickly before settling into something unreadable. Plunkett said you'd probably be looking for me, Farrow said. Not looking, Mara said. She sat down on the step across from her. But I thought we might run into each other. Farrow looked at her hands. She was still in her work clothes. She'd been on shift since 7 in the morning and clearly hadn't stopped. I heard about Pratt, and Strand, and Kellerman. Yes, and Brack. A pause. Brack I knew was doing something. I didn't know the full shape of it. I just knew he was adjusting things after the fact and that Kellerman wasn't stopping him. She looked up. If I'd said something, the investigators need to hear everything you know, Mara said. The order of events, the timeline of when you noticed things, what you did with that information internally, and why, all of it. She paused. That's not a lecture. That's just what needs to happen next. Farrow was quiet for a moment. You're not angry at me, she said. It sounded like a question. You told me I wasn't the first person he'd run out of here for asking the wrong questions, Mara said. You said it in a way that told me something was wrong without putting yourself in a position you weren't ready for. That's more than a lot of people would have done. She paused. I'm not angry. Farrow exhaled slowly. I've been here 11 years. This is the only hospital in the county. She pulled her knees in slightly. I have 2 kids. My husband works construction. The work dries up in winter. This job is the... She stopped. I know how that sounds. Well, it sounds like a person in a real situation making a decision that made sense in that context, Mara said. You're not on trial. Farrow looked at her for a long time. Why are you being decent about this? Mara considered the question honestly. Because you're not the problem, she said. You were caught in it, same as the patients were. Different way. But it was still a system that used the leverage it had. Farrow pressed the back of her hand to her mouth briefly. She wasn't crying, but she was close to it in the way of someone who'd been holding something compressed all day, and the pressure was starting to find its edges. Talk to the investigators, Mara said, tomorrow morning. Bring everything you remember. Don't minimize and don't embellish. Just tell it exactly as you observed it. They're going to be more interested in the timeline than in judgment. Farrow nodded. Mara stood. Go home. Sleep. She paused. I mean that in the practical sense. You've been on shift for what, 12 hours? 13. Go home. She left the stairwell and went back to the main corridor. The ER had quieted to its late-night register. Still busy by normal standards, but the surge had settled into the ordinary chaos of a trauma center moving through its overnight. The Route 9 casualties had been distributed, transferred, discharged, or admitted, and the bays had cycled into fresh intake. A different energy than the afternoon, exhausted but stabilized. The post-surge mood of a department that had done what it needed to do and was now running on the grim momentum of the late shift. Mara walked through once, out of habit rather than purpose. Nobody stopped her. Her badge was gone, but at this point the staff who'd seen her in the afternoon had a different category for her than unauthorized visitor, and the staff who hadn't seen her were busy enough not to question a person moving with purpose in scrubs. Tyler's bay was empty. He'd been moved to a monitored pediatric room upstairs, which was where he should be, and his mother was probably with him. She was almost at the exit when the PA system crackled. "Dr. Voss to the administrative level. Dr. Voss." She stopped. She stood in the corridor of the emergency department and heard it again. "Dr. Voss, administrative level, urgent." Nobody said anything around her. Two nurses at the nearby station continued their work. An orderly moving a gurney didn't look up, but Mara stood very still. Her name. With a title she didn't hold. On a PA system she didn't have access to, in a building where she'd been terminated. She looked at the ceiling speaker as though it owed her an explanation. Then she looked at the clock on the ER wall. It was 9:47 p.m. Then her phone buzzed. The number was blocked. She answered it anyway. The voice on the other end was one she hadn't heard in 4 years and recognized in the first syllable. "Mara," Colonel Devereaux said, "don't go to the administrative level. I need you to go to the west exit, the loading dock side, and I need you to do it in the next 3 minutes." "Why?" she said, flat. "Because the person who initiated the deletion protocol from off-site?" A pause. "They're not off-site anymore. They've been in this building for the last 40 minutes, and they're not here for the records." She was already moving. "How do you know this?" she said. "Because I've had eyes on them for 6 months," he said, "and because 20 minutes ago they walked through the hospital's service entrance on a staff credential that should have been deactivated 8 months ago." Another pause. "And because the only person in this building whose documentation connects all of it, the hospital fraud, the procurement network, and the operation that intersects with your unit's action 4 years ago, is you." The corridor to the west wing was ahead of her. She pushed through the door. "The credential," she said. "Whose was it?" Devereaux said the name. She stopped walking for exactly 1 second. The credential belonged to someone who'd been listed in Torrance's warrant as a cooperating witness. Someone who'd left Harcourt 6 months ago under circumstances that the investigation had classified as voluntary departure. Someone whose name had appeared in the procurement records as an authorizing signatory. Not a primary, a secondary, low enough in the chain to look administrative and meaningless. Someone who knew exactly what Mara had documented, and who knew exactly where she was. She started walking again, faster. "West exit," she said. 30 seconds, Devereaux said. "There's a vehicle. White, government plates. They'll see you come out." "And the person inside the building?" "Being located," he said. "We don't have eyes on them in the last 8 minutes, which means they're avoiding the camera corridors, which means they know the layout." A staff employee who knew the layout. Who knew what Mara had? Who needed that documentation gone before a federal witness could walk out of this building with it? The loading dock exit was at the end of the corridor. A heavy fire door with a push bar, the kind that had a delay alarm when opened without a key card. She didn't have a key card. She had about 30 feet. She was thinking about Darnell Pugh, who'd ended up in this building by accident and had been trying to reach her for reasons she didn't fully have yet. She was thinking about the card he'd given her, which was in the front pocket of her jacket. She was thinking about 3 weeks of notes on her phone and 45 minutes of formal statement and a deleted server directory that now existed only in Rivera's captured backup and in her own memory. 20 feet. She was thinking about the service corridor to her left. She hadn't looked down it, but she was tracking it in her peripheral vision. And whether it connected to the loading dock or dead-ended. 10 feet. She was not thinking about the possibility that she'd been wrong to stay in this building past the point when any reasonable version of herself would have walked away. She'd been right to stay. The day had confirmed it. She hit the push bar. The alarm started immediately. A single sustained tone, different from the mass casualty alarm, the kind that triggered a security alert at the front desk rather than a clinical response. She pushed through into the cold night air of the loading dock. The white vehicle was there. She was moving toward it when she heard the door behind her open again. Not her door, the other one. The service corridor door 20 feet to her left. She didn't stop moving, but she heard footsteps, and they were fast. She didn't look back. That was the first decision, made in the fraction of a second between hearing the door and processing what it meant. Don't look back. Don't slow down. Don't give whoever was behind her the information that she'd heard them. She kept her pace, kept her line toward the white vehicle, and used the sound of the footsteps to build a picture without turning around. Fast. Deliberate. Not running yet. The gait of someone who was trying to close distance without announcing that they were closing it. 20 feet between her and the vehicle. 15. The passenger window came down. The agent inside was one of Torrance's. She recognized him from the conference room, the one who'd been on the phone in the corner. He read her approach and the space behind her in a single look, and his door was already opening before she reached the vehicle. "Get in the back," he said. She did. He got out. The footsteps behind her stopped. She turned then because she was in the vehicle, and the vehicle's door was closing and she could afford to turn. The person standing at the loading dock door was a woman in her late 30s, dark coat, hospital staff lanyard tucked inside it, dark hair pulled back. She'd stopped 6 feet from the door she'd come through, and she was looking at the agent walking toward her with the expression of someone running a rapid calculation and finding all the columns coming up wrong. Her name was Nadine Corso. She'd worked at Harcourt General for 3 years as a clinical operations coordinator under Dr. Strand before quietly transitioning to an affiliated facility 8 months ago. In Torrance's warrant, she was listed as a cooperating witness, low in the chain, administrative, apparently peripheral. In the procurement records, she was listed as a secondary authorizing signatory on 17 controlled substance orders. In the investigation Devereaux had been building for 6 months, she was something else entirely. The connection point between Harcourt's internal fraud and the procurement network that extended well beyond it. The person who moved information between layers, the person who knew which records connected what to what and who needed to ensure that certain records, and certain people who could read them, didn't survive the day intact. Mara watched through the window as the agent reached Corso. Watched Corso take one step back and then stop. Watched the second agent come around the far side of the building. She hadn't seen him, hadn't known he was there, which meant Devereaux's people had been positioned before she'd come out the door. Watched Corso's calculation finish and come up empty, and her shoulders drop by a single degree, which was the only visible signal of the thing collapsing inside her. The door to Mara's right opened. Devereaux got in. She hadn't seen him in 4 years. He was grayer at the temples than she remembered. He had a scar along his left jawline that she didn't recognize from before, which meant it had happened since she'd last seen him, which meant there was a story she didn't have. He was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, no insignia, but he carried his rank the way people carry things that are structural, not cosmetic. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You look tired," he said. "I've had a long day," she said. "I know." He looked out the window at where Torrance's agent was securing Corso. "You did well." "I documented things on my phone for 3 weeks because I didn't know what else to do with what I was seeing," she said. "That's not heroic. That's just paying attention." "Most people don't," he said. She watched them lead Corso toward another vehicle. Corso wasn't fighting it. She was past the calculation phase and into whatever came after. That particular blankness of someone who'd been operating under significant pressure for a long time and had just had the structural reason for that pressure removed. How much of what she was trying to do tonight would she have succeeded at, Mara said. Against you specifically? He considered it. She knew you'd given a formal statement. She knew the phone documentation was already in evidence. She wasn't going to be able to undo that. He paused. But she might have been able to complicate the broader investigation, the part that extends past Harcourt. If she'd gotten to you before you reached a secured location, she could have controlled the narrative around what you know versus what you can prove. She wasn't going to hurt me, Mara said. She said it as an assessment, not a reassurance. Probably not physically. he agreed. There are cleaner ways to neutralize a witness. She sat with that for a moment. You've been building this for 6 months, she said. Longer. 6 months at the pace where it was real. He looked at her. We didn't know you were at Harcourt until 4 days ago. That was genuinely not planned. 4 days ago, she said. Not 3 weeks. 4 days. Which means for 3 weeks you were inside this situation without anyone knowing you were there, doing exactly what you were trained to do, and also exactly what a competent nurse does, which is notice when something is wrong with the patient. He paused. In this case, the patient was the institution. She looked out the window. The parking lot had the slightly unreal quality of late-night institutional spaces. The floodlights, the empty visitor spots, the way darkness pooled at the edges of the lit areas. The white vehicle with Corso in it was moving now, pulling toward the access road. She'll talk, Devereaux said. Once she's in custody and she understands the full weight of what she's facing, she'll cooperate. The people above her in the network are the ones she needs to be afraid of, not the investigators. He paused. That's not your problem to solve. I just wanted you to know the shape of it. The statement I gave Torrance's team, she said. The second part, the part about the unit, goes to a different desk, different jurisdiction. You'll be contacted within the week. He looked at her directly. It's going to ask something of you. I figured. You don't have to say yes. She turned to look at him. In the 4 years since she'd left service, she'd built something that looked like an ordinary life, or was trying to. The nursing degree, the job application, the idea that she could be useful in a smaller, less costly way. She didn't regret any of it. The work of a nurse on a medical floor was real, and it mattered, and she'd been doing it for reasons that were genuine, not because she was hiding from something else. But she'd also never managed to fully flatten the part of herself that had been shaped by the 4 years before that. It was structural, the same way Devereaux's rank was structural. Not something you put on, not something you took off. I know, she said. He nodded once. Get some rest, he said. I mean it. The next few days are going to require you functional. He got out. She stayed in the vehicle while it took her around to the main entrance, and she went back inside the building, and she found an empty chair in the waiting area near the window, and sat in it and looked at the parking lot from the other side of the glass, and was quiet for a while. The days that followed had their own kind of chaos, which was different from the acute chaos of that Tuesday, but no less consuming. The federal investigation moved at the velocity of something that had been building for a long time and had finally found open ground. Warrants expanded. Personnel at the affiliated facilities connected to Harcourt's network were interviewed, some voluntarily and some not. The procurement records, what survived the deletion attempt, what Rivera's team recovered from the backup, what Mara's documentation provided in terms of timeline and cross-reference, built a picture that the Assistant U.S. Attorney's Office described, in the understated language of legal documents, as extensive. Douglas Pratt was arraigned on 12 counts: wire fraud, healthcare fraud, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy charges that connected the hospital's internal scheme to the larger network. His attorney, who was very good, managed to get him released on substantial bail. He wore a suit to the arraignment that was the same quality as the suits he'd worn to run the hospital, and he looked at the cameras outside the courthouse with the controlled expression of a man who had not yet fully accepted that the thing he'd built was done. Dr. Alicia Strand faced 9 counts, which included patient endangerment charges tied directly to 2 of the 3 adverse outcomes following irregular transfers. She did not accept a plea deal in the first round of negotiations. Her attorney said she was cooperating. The prosecutor said something different. Kellerman accepted a plea deal on the 4th day. He provided information about the procurement network that corroborated what Torrance's team had already assembled and filled in gaps that would have taken months to recover from the deleted files. His sentencing would reflect his cooperation, which was the agreement, and which Mara had no feelings about either way. What he knew mattered more than what happened to him at this specific moment in the investigation. Sheldon Brack provided a written statement from custody that detailed, in precise and somewhat self-pitying terms, exactly how the documentation alteration system had worked and who had instructed him to do it and when. His statement was useful primarily because it confirmed a timeline, and it was self-pitying primarily because he seemed to genuinely believe that following instructions was a complete defense against the consequences of what those instructions produced. Nadine Corso, as Devereaux had predicted, talked. Not immediately. She spent 48 hours saying nothing, which was her legal right. And then she talked in the specific, structured way of someone who had understood the shape of their situation and had made a decision about which direction offered any survivable outcome. Her cooperation opened the investigation into the network's upper structure in ways that Torrance described, in a brief phone call to Mara on the 5th day, as significant. "You'll see it in the news eventually," Torrance said, "probably in a form that's been simplified to the point of inaccuracy, but the general shape will be there." "I'm not looking for coverage," Mara said. "I know." A pause. "Your documentation, the 3-week record, it's been entered as evidence in 4 separate proceedings. I wanted you to know that. What you saw and wrote down on your phone, in your personal notes, at the end of shifts, matters in a concrete legal sense." Mara was quiet for a moment. "How's Howard Finch?" A short pause. "The patient from room 318? "Yes." I'd have to check." Torrance's voice shifted slightly. "I'll find out." She called back 2 hours later. Finch had been discharged the previous day, anticoagulation properly managed, with outpatient follow-up scheduled. His daughter had filed a formal complaint about the billing discrepancy in his records. It was one of approximately 40 patient billing complaints now being consolidated into the fraud proceedings. "He's fine," Torrance said. "Good," Mara said. That was the one that mattered most, in the specific way that first things often carry disproportionate weight. He'd been the first patient whose records she'd looked at and known something was wrong. He'd been the mechanism for her termination. He was fine. Harcourt General did not close. That was one of the things people worried about in the first week, publicly, in the local paper, on the county social media pages, where the community processed things like the arrest of the hospital's chief administrator. The fear was practical. It was the only trauma center for 100 miles, and if it collapsed under the weight of the investigation, the consequences for the county would be immediate and severe. It didn't collapse. The state health department stepped in with emergency oversight within 48 hours. An interim administrative team was installed, people from the state office experienced in exactly this kind of institutional crisis, with the particular skill set of keeping a facility operational while its leadership structure was being dismantled. They were not warm, they were not inspiring. They were competent in the way that emergency management competence looked, unglamorous, procedural, and exactly what the situation required. The staff stayed. Most of them. Plunkett worked her shifts. Farrow gave her statement to the investigators on the Wednesday. All of it, the timeline, everything she'd observed and suppressed and rationalized, delivered in the flat, careful tone of someone paying a debt they'd been carrying for longer than they wanted to admit. The investigators were, as Mara had told her they would be, more interested in the timeline than in judgment. The ER kept running. The third-floor medical unit kept running. Tyler, the 15-year-old from Route 9, was discharged on the Thursday with his mother and a referral to an outpatient endocrinology practice 60 miles south. His mother sent a card to the nursing unit. It said thank you, which was simple and true and was, in the accounting of this particular week, enough. On the 8th day, Mara got a call from a number she recognized as the hospital's main line. She answered it. The voice on the other end was the interim administrative director, a woman named Paulson, who had the direct, unsentimental manner of someone who had no personal investment in the politics of the situation and was therefore capable of seeing it clearly. "Ms. Voss," she said, "I'd like to meet with you at your convenience. I've reviewed your personnel file, the investigation records, and the incident documentation from your 3 weeks on staff." "All right," Mara said. "Your termination was procedurally improper and substantively unfounded," Paulson said. "The documentation error used as its basis has been reviewed and cleared. The error was not yours." A pause. "I'm prepared to offer you formal reinstatement with full back pay for the period since your termination." Mara was quiet. "I'd also like to discuss a different role," Paulson continued. "The facility has an immediate structural need, but the investigation has made that obvious. And we have a gap in emergency preparedness coordination that's going to become critical as we move through the oversight period. I'd like to talk about whether that's something you'd consider." "I'm a first-year nurse," Mara said. You're a former combat medic with 4 years of high-intensity field experience who spent 3 weeks in this facility noticing things that administrators with decades of tenure either didn't see or chose not to act on, Paulson said. The title is less important than the function. A pause. What's the role? Mara said. Director of Emergency Preparedness and Trauma Training, Paulson said. It's a new position. We're creating it specifically for the oversight period and the reform process. The scope is facility-wide. You'd be responsible for mass casualty protocol, staff trauma training, and coordination with county and federal emergency management. She paused. It's a significant step for someone at your career stage. I'm aware of that. I'm offering it because the situation is significant, and I don't have time to find someone more credentialed who will also actually do what needs to be done. Mara sat with it. She thought about the loaded dock door and the cold air and the sound of footsteps. She thought about Howard Finch and Tyler and the woman in Bay 2 with the unsecured cervical collar. She thought about Denise Farrow on the stairwell landing with her arms wrapped around her knees, and Plunkett at the cafeteria table with both hands around her coffee cup, and the young nurse trying to establish an IV line on a shifting gurney and doing it anyway when someone told her to brace against the wall. She thought about 3 weeks of paying attention in a building that had tried very hard to make her feel like paying attention was the wrong thing to do. When do you need an answer? She said. End of the week, Paulson said. I'll call you tomorrow, Mara said. She called Devereaux first. Not for permission, she wasn't asking for that, and he wouldn't have offered it. She called because he was the person who most fully held both versions of her life in the same frame, and she wanted to say the thing out loud to someone who would understand what she was actually deciding. The hospital wants me back, she said. Different capacity. I heard, he said. Of course you did. It's a reasonable choice, he said. It's also a harder job than it sounds. Most things are. The other thing, the statement, the follow-up, that's going to require you to travel, probably more than once. The hospital work and the other work aren't incompatible, but they're not going to be convenient to balance. I know. He was quiet for a moment. When you separated, he said, I thought you were done. I thought you'd built a wall and you were going to live behind it, and I didn't blame you. What you gave in those 4 years it was more than most people have. A pause. I was wrong about the wall. There's no wall, she said. I just needed to find a different way to do the same thing. Taking care of people. Paying attention, she corrected, and then doing something about what I see. A short silence. Yes, he said, that. She called Paulson the next morning. She accepted the role. She negotiated 3 specific terms: a structured schedule that would accommodate her obligations to the federal proceedings, a mandate to review and overhaul the facility's internal reporting protocols as a first-order task, and the authority to recommend staff additions to the ER without the approval of positions that no longer existed anyway. Paulson accepted all 3 without counteroffer, which told Mara that the interim director had prepared for this conversation and had come in with flexibility she was ready to use. Monday, Paulson said. Monday, Mara agreed. Bewusstment. She went in on a Sunday, not for any official reason. Her start date was Monday, and Paulson had made it clear there was no expectation of Sunday presence. She went because she wanted to walk the building alone, without a role or a task or a security escort, before she walked in the next morning with all of those things in place. The lobby on a Sunday afternoon was quieter than it had been on any day of her 3-week tenure. Families coming in for visits, a few people in the chairs by the windows, the information desk staffed by a volunteer who was reading a paperback and looked up when Mara came in and looked back down. The television was playing a weather forecast. The floor had been waxed recently. She could smell it, the slightly chemical institutional clean that she'd long since stopped noticing as a smell in its own right, but registered now because she was paying a different kind of attention. She walked the main corridor, the 3rd floor medical unit, the ER entrance, the administrative level with its empty offices, Pratt's, Strand's, Kellerman's, all of them cleaned out by the investigation and not yet reassigned. The kind of emptied rooms that held an absence more loudly than they'd held a presence. She stood at the window at the end of the administrative corridor and looked at the parking lot. Empty of military vehicles now. Just ordinary civilian cars and the hospital's transport vans and the maintenance truck that was parked at an angle near the far fence because whoever drove it had pulled in fast and hadn't straightened up. She thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when she'd watched the convoy arrive through those lobby windows. She'd been on her way out. Her locker was empty and her bag was on her shoulder, and she hadn't named it at the time, but she could name it now. The specific hollow exhaustion of someone who'd tried to do the right thing in an environment that had organized itself specifically to prevent the right thing from having any traction. She'd stayed anyway. Not because she'd known what the military convoy meant. She hadn't. Not because she'd had a plan. She hadn't had that either. She'd stayed because the alarm had gone off, and there were people in the emergency department who needed help, and she was standing right there with the training to provide it, and walking away from that to protect herself from an institution that had already fired her was a calculation she couldn't make that way. It occurred to her, standing at the window on a Sunday afternoon, that the thing that had kept her in the building that morning was the same thing that had kept her documenting discrepancies on her phone for 3 weeks without telling anyone, and the same thing that had kept her functioning in a field environment for 11 weeks without reliable evacuation. And the same thing that had made her stop and look at a teenage boy who was too still and too pale and ask the right question before anyone pushed fluids. It wasn't bravery. Bravery was a word people used for things they didn't fully understand from the inside. From the inside, it didn't feel like bravery. It felt like the absence of a certain kind of option. The option of looking at a situation and calculating that the cost of acting was too high, and therefore not acting. That option had never fully loaded for her. She didn't know if that was a gift or a defect. Probably both. Most things that shaped you were. She turned away from the window. Monday was a different kind of day. She arrived at 7. Her badge was new, her name, her photograph, her title in small text below. Director, Emergency Preparedness and Trauma Training. She clipped it to her jacket and walked through the main entrance without being escorted, and the security guard at the desk nodded at her, and she nodded back. Paulson met her on the administrative level at 7:15 and walked her through the scope, the immediate priorities, the staff she'd be coordinating with. It was a thorough and unsentimental briefing, which was the appropriate kind for the situation. They spent 90 minutes going through the mass casualty protocol documentation. The existing protocol, which had several structural gaps that the Route 9 response had exposed, and the revision framework that Mara had already begun drafting in her head. At 9, she had her first meeting with the ER team. Plunkett was there, a resident she didn't know. 2 nurses from the day shift who'd been working when Mara had moved through the department during the surge, and who recognized her without being sure what category to put her in now. She stood at the head of the table and looked at the people in the room. "I'm not here to tell you what you did wrong," she said. "You managed a mass casualty event with inadequate resources and outdated protocols, and you kept people alive. That's the baseline." She paused. "What I'm here to do is make sure the next time something like Route 9 happens, you have better tools, better communication structure, a triage system that doesn't collapse under surge pressure." She looked around the table. "I'm going to need you to tell me exactly what broke down, where the bottlenecks were, and what you needed that you didn't have. Not the official incident report version, the actual version." A pause. Plunkett said, "The cart with the stuck wheel." A beat. Then the resident said, "The supply room door." Then one of the day shift nurses said, "The communication system going down in the first 15 minutes. And it went from there. Sham. In the weeks that followed, the investigation continued to move through its stages. The federal proceedings generated coverage. The local paper, eventually picked up by state outlets. Eventually a brief mention in a national wire story about healthcare fraud networks that described Harcourt General as one of several affiliated facilities in a larger scheme. The coverage was, as Torrance had predicted, simplified to the point of partial inaccuracy in some places. Mara read the stories once and didn't seek out further coverage. She was busy. The trauma training program she built over the first month was not polished. It was built in the gaps between operational demands, revised 3 times in the first 2 weeks, as she identified gaps in her own initial assumptions. argued over twice by people who didn't see the point of a particular protocol change until she explained it in terms of what had actually happened to actual patients on the actual day of the Route 9 event. It was collaborative in the way that collaboration actually worked. Uneven, sometimes frustrating, occasionally surprising in a good direction. Farrow came to the second training session. She sat in the back and she was attentive, and afterward she came up to Mara and said simply, "Thank you for the push." And Mara said, "You pushed back in the right places," which was true and which Farrow received without false modesty. Darnell Pugh sent her a message, through channels, appropriately routed, the way communication in that world worked, on the third week. It said, "Heard you took the position. Good." He'd been discharged from Harcourt the night of the event, and she hadn't seen him since, and she didn't know when or if she'd see him again, and that was fine. Some connections existed for a specific moment and then continued in their own way, and you didn't need the full thread to understand the weave. The federal contact came, as Devereaux had said it would. She traveled twice in the first 6 weeks. The work was specific and constrained, and she was clear-eyed about its limits. She wasn't the center of the broader investigation. She was a witness with particular knowledge, and the value of that was concrete and bounded and would eventually resolve. She did it carefully and thoroughly and came back to Caldwell and went to work on Monday morning. On a Thursday in late January, about 10 weeks after the Tuesday that had changed the shape of things, Mara was in the ER running a triage protocol drill with the day shift, when the charge nurse, Plunkett, who had taken the charge position when the interim administration had reorganized the floor, came to the door and said, "There's something happening in the lobby." "What kind of something?" Mara said. Plunkett looked at her with the expression of someone who knew the answer but was aware it would not translate well in summary. "You should come see." The lobby was full. Not full in the usual sense, not the busy transactional fullness of a hospital lobby during visiting hours. Full in the sense of people who had come here specifically, who had arranged themselves with intention, who were present for a reason. Local families she recognized from the Route 9 aftermath. Several of the county EMS personnel who'd worked the accident, hospital staff, off shift, in civilian clothes, standing in the space where they normally worked. A cluster of people near the windows who had the bearing of veterans without the uniforms, the posture, the way they arranged themselves in a room. And then, at the far side of the lobby, the doors opened. They were in uniform. 12 of them. Not 100, not a formation designed for spectacle, but 12 people who had made a deliberate choice to come to this specific building on this specific day, and who walked in with the straightforward purposefulness of people who had something to do and were doing it. Harwick was at the front. Behind him, people she didn't recognize and one she did. Pugh, shoulder in a sling, dressed in service uniform, moving with the slightly compensated gait of someone whose body was still settling its debts from Route 9. They walked to the center of the lobby and stopped. The room had gone quiet the way the room had gone quiet on that first day, but differently. That silence had been the silence of shock, of something that didn't compute. This silence was different. This was the silence of people who understood what they were witnessing and were choosing to be present in it fully. Harwick looked at Mara. She was standing near the ER entrance with her badge clipped to her jacket and a training clipboard in her hand that she'd forgotten she was holding until this moment. He nodded. Once. And then he came to attention. 12 people in uniform came to attention. And then they saluted her. She stood in the lobby of Harcourt General Medical Center and absorbed what was happening without flinching, because she was not someone who flinched, and because she had spent enough of her life in the company of people who expressed respect through specific formal acts to understand what this one cost and what it meant. These were not people who performed sentiment. The salute was a statement of fact. You did something that mattered, and we are telling you we know it. She didn't cry. She thought she might, and she didn't. What she felt was quieter than tears, something that sat in the chest and radiated outward without drama, the particular sensation of a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing it, having been, finally and completely, put down. She transferred the clipboard to her left hand, and she returned the salute. People sometimes want the moment to be the ending. The salute, the cleared name, the new title on the badge. They want that to be where the story stops, because it's clean and resolved and satisfying in the way that completions are satisfying. But that's not actually how it works. The moment doesn't end anything. It's the confirmation of a turning, not the turning itself. The turning happened earlier, in smaller moments, when there was no audience and no acknowledgement. The first time she documented a discrepancy on her phone and didn't talk herself out of it. The moment she turned away from the exit and walked back into the emergency department when the alarm sounded. The moment she stood in the parking lot and walked toward Harwick without knowing what would happen when she reached him. Those were the moments that mattered. The lobby, the salute, the new role. Those were just the record catching up with the reality. What Mara understood, standing in that lobby with the winter light coming through the windows and the people of her county around her, patients and staff and veterans and families, was something that she hadn't had language for during the 3 weeks she'd spent being the person nobody looked at twice. Being dismissed is not the same as being diminished. The people who looked past her had not seen less than she was. They had simply seen what they'd decided to see, which was never the same as the truth. The truth was patient. The truth was stubborn in the way of things that are structurally accurate. It didn't need to be argued or defended. It just needed to keep being true. And she'd kept being who she was regardless of how the room read her, not because she was performing integrity for an eventual audience, but because the alternative required becoming someone she wasn't, and she'd never been able to make that trade. That was the thing she'd carry into the work going forward, not the recognition, not the vindication, not the new title. The knowledge that staying true to what she saw and what she knew, even when the institution around her was organized against it, had not been wasted. Nothing honest is wasted, even when it costs you everything in the short term. Even when the only person who knows what you're doing is you, even then. Harwick lowered his salute. The room breathed again. Plunkett said something to the nurse beside her. Pugh, across the lobby, caught Mara's eye and gave her a nod that communicated about 40 things in the space of a gesture. Mara lowered her hand. She looked at the room, at the people in it, the building around them, the work still to be done. Then she clipped her clipboard back under her arm, turned toward the ER, and went back to work.